Welcome, my dear literature enthusiasts. It always feels like a small gathering of kindred spirits when I sit down to record these reflections, as though we're sharing a quiet corner of a library or a late-night cafe, wrapped in the kind of conversations that stretch on far longer than we ever plan. Before we dive into today's exploration, I'd love to gently remind you to like and subscribe if this kind of thoughtful, slow-burning discussion resonates with you. It means a lot to me, not just as a gesture of support, but as a way of saying, yes, these deep dives matter. What we're about to embark on is not a traditional review, not at all. Think of it as an intellectual and literary excavation, a critical analysis intended for those who find as much joy in dissecting themes, symbols, and human truths as they do in the surface pleasures of cinema. The film in question is The Dark Knight, 2008. I mentioned the name here once so that we're all on the same page, and from this moment forward, I'll let the work breathe without having to repeat its title. For me, this story has always lived in the background of my life like a haunting melody, a piece of art I return to when I need to think about the complexity of good and evil, the blurred lines between order and chaos, and the fragile structures that hold a society together. When I first encountered it, I wasn't sitting in a grand theater with booming speakers and an audience of strangers. Instead, I was alone, with nothing but dim light and an old television set humming faintly in the corner of my room. That solitude was important. It meant I was free to wrestle with the emotions it stirred in me without the filter of anyone else's reactions. And I can still remember the chill I felt, that subtle tightening in the chest, as if the story was holding up a mirror not just to the characters but to my own inner contradictions. It was one of those rare cinematic moments where the screen feels less like a window and more like a confession. Now, to step back for a moment, let me sketch a broad outline of what this film is about. On the surface, it's a crime drama dressed in the garb of a superhero spectacle. There are capes, masks, and the kind of grand confrontations you'd expect. But beneath that spectacle lies a philosophical inquiry, a moral labyrinth that refuses to offer easy answers. What we witness is a battle not simply between individuals, but between worldviews, one that clings to structure, justice, and sacrifice, and another that delights in dismantling all of it just to prove a point about human fragility. The world in which this story unfolds is familiar yet heightened. A city both alive and decaying at once, filled with shadows that seem almost sentient, as though the architecture itself has grown weary of human corruption. This city becomes more than a backdrop. It's a living, breathing participant in the drama, echoing the contradictions of its inhabitants. Watching it, I often think of Dostoevsky's Petersburg or Dickens's London, urban landscapes that expose, magnify, and sometimes even corrupt the souls that move through them. If I were to summarize the plot briefly, and I say briefly because I'd rather not spoil the intricate turns for those who haven't yet experienced it, the story follows a vigilante struggling to maintain order in a city on the verge of collapse. He finds himself pitted against an adversary who refuses to play by any known rules. Every encounter between them feels like a test of philosophy, a wager on whether morality has any real foundation when faced with raw, unfiltered chaos. The brilliance of it lies not in a single twist or a singular revelation, but in the way tension builds and builds until every decision feels like it could topple the fragile balance of civilization itself. One of the aspects that always stands out to me is how the narrative keeps teasing us with the possibility of stability, only to snatch it away at the last moment. Just when you think things are about to settle, another eruption of disorder upends the trajectory. It's like a symphony composed not of harmony but of interruptions. And isn't life a little like that too? Just when we think we've mastered our routines, something, or someone, arrives to remind us how precarious our sense of control really is. There's a character here whose sheer unpredictability still unsettles me. He represents the kind of force you can't reason with, can't bargain with, can't classify within the normal boundaries of hero and villain. He is less a person and more an idea, one that strips away the polite fictions society tells itself about fairness, order, and rationality. I remember watching him for the first time and feeling not just fear, but recognition. Recognition of that tiny, whispered part of myself that wonders, what if none of this order matters? What if beneath our systems and laws, all that really exists is chaos? It was uncomfortable, like brushing against the raw edge of a thought you're not supposed to admit to having. What deepened the experience for me wasn't only the performances, though they were, of course, remarkable, but the writing itself. Every line of dialogue seemed carefully weighted, heavy with implication, like pieces of a riddle that could be rearranged endlessly. Literature has taught me that great writing isn't always about answers. It's about crafting the kind of questions that won't let you sleep easily at night. This story embodies that principle fully. Its characters debate, not in lofty academic terms, but in life-or-death gambits, with the city itself hanging in the balance. And when the credits finally roll, you're left not with closure but with a lingering ache, a reminder that the questions will follow you long after the lights come back on. Something that fascinates me is how the film resists tidy morality. The central figure, the so-called hero, doesn't embody perfection. He's haunted, scarred, and often conflicted about his own methods. Watching him, I thought about how often we, too, disguise our compromises as noble choices. He wants to be a symbol of hope, but he also realizes that to win this war, he might have to embody something darker. That contradiction speaks volumes about the human condition. We want to believe we are pure in our intentions, yet survival often demands a kind of corruption, however subtle. It's the classic literary theme of the flawed protagonist, and it resonates because perfection rarely exists outside of stories meant for children. One scene in particular, and I won't spoil its details, struck me as one of the most devastating philosophical experiments I've ever seen on screen. It's a moment where ordinary people are forced into an impossible moral dilemma, the kind of decision that reveals not just individual character but collective values. I remember sitting back, stunned, asking myself what I would do in their position. And the truth is, I didn't know. That's when you realize you're watching more than a movie. You're participating in an examination of ethics itself. I've often wondered why this story resonates with me so much more deeply than many others in the same genre. Part of it, I think, has to do with timing. I first watched it during a period in my life when I was questioning authority, questioning morality, and grappling with the thin line between order and oppression. I'd been reading Camus and Nietzsche around that time, trying to piece together a worldview that could make sense of life's absurdities. And here, on screen, was a drama wrestling with the very same questions. It felt uncanny, as though the universe had conspired to bring philosophy out of the pages of dusty books and into the living, breathing realm of performance. Another reason it stays with me is its atmosphere. There's a weight to the visuals that mirrors the weight of its themes. The colors are muted, the light often harsh, and the cityscape feels suffocating at times, as though we're caught in a perpetual twilight where dawn may never come. That aesthetic choice is no accident. It amplifies the sense of unease, the feeling that no one is entirely safe, not even the viewer. It reminds me of how certain novels use setting not just as a backdrop but as a character itself, shaping the actions and psychology of everyone within it. When I talk to friends about this film, I often find myself slipping into the language of literature rather than cinema. I describe its characters as archetypes, its conflicts as allegories, its twists as narrative devices that feel ripped from the pages of some grand, tragic novel. And maybe that's why I love it so much. It blurs the line between mediums, reminding me that stories, whether told in words or images, are all part of the same human endeavor to understand ourselves. The more I think about it, the more I realize that what makes this particular tale endure is its refusal to resolve neatly. It's the kind of work that invites you to return, again and again, each time finding new shadows lurking in familiar corners. I've rewatched it multiple times over the years, and every viewing feels like peeling back another layer of meaning. Sometimes, it's the smallest details, a glance, a gesture, a silence, that unlock new interpretations. That, to me, is the hallmark of art that lasts. It grows with you, revealing different truths depending on who you are when you encounter it. And so, as we prepare to delve deeper into the analysis ahead, I invite you to sit with these questions rather than rush toward answers. Think of this less as me reviewing a film for you and more as us embarking together on a shared meditation. I'm not here to tell you what to think or to declare definitive interpretations. Instead, I want to open doors, to stories, to symbols, to the unsettling beauty of ambiguity. Because in the end, isn't that why we gather here, as lovers of literature and art? To confront the mysteries of existence, not to solve them but to let them shape us in ways we don't always expect. So here we are, at the threshold of one of the most layered cinematic journeys of our time. A story of chaos and order, of heroes and villains who refuse to fit cleanly into either category, of a city that mirrors the moral struggles of all who walk within it. I feel a little thrill every time I start this conversation, because I know we're not just talking about a movie. We're talking about what it means to live, to choose, to falter, and to hope, even when the world feels like it's teetering on the brink of collapse. Stay with me, my friends. The analysis is just beginning. When I think back on this story, what always comes to me first is the sound of that opening. The feeling of a city caught in mid-breath, as though the air itself is waiting for something to happen. There's no grand overture, no polite introduction. We're simply dropped into the middle of a scheme, a job, a crime already in motion. And isn't that just like life? How often do we step into situations already underway, piecing together meaning only as events unfold? The first images burned into my mind are of masked men, their faces hidden not by elegance but by grotesque clown disguises, carrying with them the aura of something planned with precision yet executed with reckless abandon. I remember leaning closer, fascinated by the choreography of it all. Each man has his task. Each movement is exact. But beneath the structure, there's a strange chaos, a sense that loyalty here is transactional, temporary. You can almost smell the distrust in the air. What struck me wasn't just the crime itself, the cold efficiency with which they cut through glass and wires, but the way these men treated one another. There's no camaraderie, no shared thrill of rebellion. Instead, they pick each other off like pieces in a cruel game, thinning their own ranks until only one remains. Watching that, I felt a tightening in my chest. How many of us walk through life thinking we're working toward a common goal, only to discover that others see us as expendable, replaceable? It was brutal, but it was also honest in a way that made me uncomfortable. And then there he was, the architect of it all, the one who survives because he planned every betrayal. The moment his mask came off, I felt a shiver. Not because of what he looked like, but because of what he represented, unpredictability made flesh. It's rare in both film and life to encounter someone who operates outside all recognizable patterns. I've often wondered what it would be like to face such a person, someone whose motives can't be bargained with. It's terrifying precisely because it feels unstoppable. From there, the story shifts, like the tightening of a lens. Suddenly we're looking at the institutions of power, the police, the politicians, the protectors of order. They're scrambling, trying to keep up with a threat they can barely define. And at the center of it all is a city whose heartbeat is uneven, faltering. You can sense how weary its people are, how tired they've become of corruption and broken promises. It reminds me of passages I've read in Dickens, where the city itself is a character, carrying the weight of everyone's sins and sorrows. And yet, amidst that decay, there are glimmers of hope. One of them arrives in the form of a young district attorney, a man unafraid to step into the spotlight, to challenge the darkness head-on. I remember the first time I saw him, how easy it was to believe in his idealism. He has that rare combination of charisma and moral clarity, the kind of presence that makes people want to believe change is possible. He reminded me of people I've known, teachers, mentors, even friends, whose optimism shines so brightly that you almost forget how fragile it is. Parallel to him, of course, is the figure we already know, the one who has chosen to wage war from the shadows, wearing the mask not to hide but to become something larger than himself. His presence here feels both reassuring and troubling. Reassuring because he stands as a bulwark against chaos, troubling because his methods blur the line between protector and oppressor. As I watched him move through the night, I kept thinking, how much of himself has he given up to become this symbol? And how much more will he lose before this story ends? The interplay between these two men, the public hero and the masked vigilante, forms a fascinating tension. Both want the same thing: justice, order, a safer world. But their paths are so different, their methods so contradictory, that you can't help but wonder if their alliance will endure or fracture. In many ways, it feels like an allegory for the struggle within each of us, the part that wants to work within the system, and the part that wants to tear it all down and rebuild it ourselves. As the narrative unfolds, the city seems to pulse with rising tension. The crime lords who once ruled comfortably in the shadows now find themselves cornered, hunted, their old systems collapsing under the weight of this new, unpredictable adversary. I found myself strangely fascinated by their fear. These are men accustomed to power, to pulling the strings without consequence. And suddenly, they're scrambling like frightened children, unsure where the next blow will come from. There's a kind of poetic justice in that, isn't there? The mighty brought low not by law but by lawlessness greater than their own. Meanwhile, the vigilante presses harder. He hunts the corrupt, dismantles the networks that once seemed untouchable. And yet, for every victory, the chaos grows. It's like cutting off the head of a hydra, two more appear in its place. Watching this, I couldn't help but think about the futility of certain battles in life. How sometimes the harder we fight, the more resistance we create, until we start to wonder if our actions are feeding the very thing we seek to destroy. One sequence that lingers in my mind is when the criminal underworld gathers in uneasy alliance, desperate to find a way out of their predicament. The setting is dim, almost suffocating, with every face lined by greed and fear. And into that room walks the wild card, the unpredictable presence that has already begun to unsettle the entire city. What follows is less a negotiation than a performance, a demonstration of dominance not through force but through sheer audacity. He mocks them, terrifies them, bends them to his will with nothing more than a few words and an unforgettable display. I remember watching that scene and thinking, this is how true power operates, not through brute strength, but through the ability to reshape reality itself, to make others doubt the ground beneath their feet. At the same time, the story pulls us into quieter, more personal moments. There's the tender thread of a relationship between the vigilante and the woman who still remembers him as he was before the mask. Their conversations ache with the weight of what could have been, of paths not taken. I found myself unexpectedly moved by those scenes, perhaps because they reminded me of my own crossroads, those moments in life when you look at someone and realize that love alone isn't enough to bridge the gulf between who you are and who you've become. And then there are the glimpses of ordinary citizens, caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control. A banker terrified into silence, a family clutching each other in fear, commuters glancing nervously at strangers on the bus. These fragments matter. They remind us that beneath the grand struggles of heroes and villains lie countless small lives, each one fragile, each one precious. It made me think of how easily we forget the human cost of conflict when we focus too much on the larger narrative. The tension keeps mounting, each scene ratcheting the pressure higher. The city's leaders try to project strength, but their voices tremble. The vigilante pushes forward, but doubt gnaws at him. The young district attorney shines brightly, but shadows gather around him. And all the while, the wild card moves freely, always one step ahead, always turning order into disorder with the flick of a wrist. There's a moment where a fundraiser meant to symbolize hope and progress is shattered, literally invaded by the embodiment of chaos itself. The contrast is striking. The opulence of the setting, the wealth and privilege of those gathered, all stripped bare in an instant by the intrusion of unpredictability. Watching it, I felt a jolt, as though the story was warning me, no matter how secure we think we are, no fortress is unbreakable. By this point, I found myself deeply invested, not just in what was happening but in what it meant. Each event seemed less like a plot point and more like a parable, a lesson about the fragility of human structures and the ease with which they can crumble. And the characters, for all their strength and conviction, felt increasingly vulnerable. You could sense the cracks forming, the inevitability of collapse. What makes this first stretch so powerful, I think, is the way it keeps you on edge without ever letting you settle. There's no clear ground to stand on. You're constantly pulled between admiration and unease, between hope and dread. It's like walking a tightrope over an abyss. You can't look away, but every step feels perilous. As the story pushes deeper, the stakes rise in ways that feel both inevitable and shocking. Alliances form and shatter, promises are made and broken, and beneath it all, the city trembles. I remember reaching this point on my first viewing and realizing I was holding my breath, caught between anticipation and fear. Because if the first half could carry this much weight, I could only imagine what awaited in the chapters still to come. There comes a point in this story where the pace quickens, almost imperceptibly at first. What began as a series of shocks and unsettling intrusions now starts to feel like a full-blown unraveling. The city itself seems to teeter, not just physically but morally, and I remember sensing that whatever illusion of stability remained was about to collapse completely. You know that strange feeling when you're on a roller coaster and you've climbed to the very top. You pause, hanging there for just a breath, and then, suddenly, the world tilts? That's exactly how this part feels. The adversary, unpredictable as ever, tightens his grip on the city not through brute force but through psychology. It isn't about robbing banks anymore or humiliating crime bosses, it's about turning society inside out. Watching his methods unfold, I felt both awe and dread. He doesn't demand wealth, doesn't even crave recognition in the traditional sense. What he wants is to watch principles collapse, to prove that human beings, when pushed far enough, will discard their morals like old clothing. And the terrifying thing is, part of me wondered if he was right. One of the earliest tremors comes in the form of a public ultimatum. Suddenly, no one feels safe, not politicians, not police, not even the so-called hero who moves in the shadows. The adversary turns the spotlight on everyone, asking impossible questions through acts of terror that spread like wildfire. It's here that we start to see the public itself bend under pressure, lashing out, demanding sacrifices, even turning on the very symbol they once hailed as protector. I remember watching this and thinking about how quickly fear corrodes solidarity. Communities, after all, are fragile things. They're built on trust, and trust is always the first casualty of terror. Parallel to this, the young district attorney, once radiant with hope and conviction, begins to face trials of his own. He still believes in the law, still fights with every ounce of strength, but you can see the cracks forming around him. His idealism collides head-on with reality, and reality doesn't play fair. He's caught between forces that refuse to compromise, forces that laugh at the very notion of fairness. Every time I revisit these moments, I'm reminded of how youth and optimism, however noble, often falter when faced with cruelty that refuses to play by the rules. It isn't weakness, it's simply the heartbreaking truth that goodness alone is rarely enough. And then comes a moment I'll never forget. The fundraiser interrupted, the chaos spilling into places once thought untouchable. Here the adversary moves not just as a criminal, but as a force of nature, a storm that rips through privilege and comfort alike. The tension in that room is suffocating. Lives hang in the balance. And the vigilante, usually so composed, so calculated, suddenly feels cornered. He can't be everywhere at once, can't save everyone, and that helplessness is written all over his movements. For me, this scene was a turning point. It's when I realized the battle wasn't about winning anymore. It was about enduring. From here, the story spirals into a sequence of games, traps within traps, schemes within schemes. Each new act of terror is designed not just to harm but to provoke a response, to lure the city's defenders into making impossible choices. It reminded me of reading ancient tragedies, where the hero's downfall is never a single blow but a series of moral compromises, each one dragging him closer to the abyss. The vigilante, too, finds himself forced into decisions that blur the line between right and wrong, and I felt the weight of each choice as though I were making it myself. One of the cruelest turns involves the young district attorney. Stripped of safety, of certainty, he's forced into a position that tests not just his courage but his very identity. Watching his torment, I found myself whispering, "Please, not him." But of course, tragedy rarely spares the ones we most want to protect. What happens to him is not just a physical wound, but a spiritual shattering, a disfiguring of the soul as much as the body. It's in this moment that the story reveals its deepest cruelty, the transformation of hope into despair, of light into darkness. And I felt it like a loss in my own life, the kind of loss you can't ever really prepare for. The vigilante, too, suffers his own defeats. He's pushed to the edge, forced to confront the possibility that his mission may be doing more harm than good. There's a sequence involving two groups of ordinary citizens, placed in a dilemma so horrifying that even recounting it makes my stomach tighten. The adversary sets them against each other, handing them the power of life and death and waiting gleefully for them to prove his theory, that deep down, everyone is selfish, everyone is brutal, and morality is nothing more than a story we tell ourselves. I remember sitting on the edge of my seat the first time I witnessed this scene, my heart pounding as though I were one of those citizens faced with the unthinkable choice. The silence, the waiting, the flicker of hesitation, it was almost unbearable. And yet what unfolded surprised me. Not because it was triumph in the conventional sense, but because it was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity sometimes chooses differently. Sometimes, against all odds, people resist the pull of despair. It was fragile, it was tentative, but it was enough to challenge the adversary's certainty. But this moment of fragile grace doesn't erase the devastation already wrought. The young district attorney, broken and reshaped by grief and rage, becomes something unrecognizable. His fall is, to me, one of the most heartbreaking transformations I've ever seen on screen. To watch someone so full of fire and promise turn into a vessel of vengeance is to witness a tragedy in the truest sense. It isn't sudden, it's a slow, agonizing descent, each step justified in his own mind, each decision tipping him further into the shadows. And I found myself grieving not just for him, but for what he represented, the possibility of a better future. The vigilante, realizing the scope of this disaster, is forced into an impossible position. How do you fight chaos on one side and corrupted justice on the other? How do you save a city when its brightest symbol of hope has been twisted beyond recognition? These questions gnawed at me, and I could feel the weight pressing on his shoulders, a burden no one person should ever have to carry. And yet he does. That's what makes him both inspiring and unbearably tragic. The climax arrives not with a single explosion or a grand confrontation, but with a series of intimate, devastating choices. Confrontations in dimly lit spaces, voices raised in desperation, lives hanging by threads. It's here that the story's true cruelty reveals itself. Victory doesn't mean triumph. It means sacrifice. It means taking on a burden so great that it crushes you, but carrying it anyway because no one else can. When the dust finally settles, when the city breathes again, it isn't because evil has been vanquished in some neat, triumphant way. It's because someone has chosen to shoulder the blame, to become the villain in order to preserve the illusion of hope. I can't describe how much this affected me the first time I saw it. I sat in stunned silence, realizing that the supposed resolution wasn't a victory at all. It was a self-inflicted wound, a deliberate choice to be misunderstood, hated, hunted, all for the sake of protecting something greater. And then came the ending, that monologue echoing like a prayer, reminding us that heroes aren't always celebrated, that sometimes the truest act of love is to be despised. The vigilante rides into the night not as a savior crowned in glory, but as an outcast, a fugitive, a shadow bearing the sins of others. I felt my throat tighten, because it was so profoundly different from the usual tales of triumph. It was closer to the stories we find in literature, stories of sacrifice, of flawed heroes who give everything and receive nothing in return. What lingers with me isn't the spectacle, though that was remarkable, nor even the performances, though they were unforgettable. What lingers is the ache of watching ideals crumble, of witnessing goodness corrupted, of seeing a man give everything and gain nothing. And yet, paradoxically, it's also a story about endurance, about holding on to hope even when it must be hidden, even when it comes disguised as loss. Every time I return to this film, I'm struck again by its refusal to let us rest in easy answers. Was the sacrifice worth it? Did the city deserve it? Was the adversary right after all? Or did humanity prove him wrong in those fragile moments of resistance? The story doesn't resolve these questions. It leaves them for us to wrestle with, like a riddle that won't let go. And maybe that's why it stays with me so powerfully. Because life, too, rarely gives us clean conclusions. It gives us choices, compromises, tragedies, and the faint hope that maybe, just maybe, we can endure. And so, when the final image fades and the credits begin to roll, I don't feel closure. I feel haunted. I feel grateful. And above all, I feel challenged to ask myself what I would do in the face of chaos, what I would sacrifice for the sake of others, and whether I could bear the weight of being misunderstood for the greater good. That, to me, is the true genius of this story. It doesn't just entertain. It transforms. What fascinates me most when I look back on this story is how it refuses to treat its characters as symbols alone. Yes, they are larger than life, almost mythic in the weight they carry. But they're also heartbreakingly human, filled with contradictions, flaws, and flickers of vulnerability. And that blend of archetype and humanity is what gives the film its staying power. Take the masked vigilante at the center. He could so easily have been written as a flawless savior, a man above temptation, a paragon of justice. But instead, what we see is someone wrestling constantly with the cost of his choices. He wears the mask not because he enjoys it, but because he cannot live without it. There's something tragic in that. The mask isn't just armor, it's a prison. I often find myself wondering how much of his true self is left beneath the performance. How many nights has he stood at the edge of his city, staring into the dark, wishing he could simply walk away? He represents, in many ways, the literary figure of the flawed hero, the Odysseus, the Hamlet, the Raskolnikov, driven by something beyond himself, unable to let go even when the burden crushes him. There's nobility in his sacrifice, but there's also arrogance. To assume that only he can save the city is, in itself, a kind of pride. And pride, as literature has shown us again and again, is often the seed of tragedy. Then there is the young district attorney, the one who shines so brightly at first, all hope and conviction. He begins as the city's great promise, a man unafraid to challenge corruption openly, a man whose face becomes a banner of justice. What makes him so compelling is not just his charisma but his fragility. He believes in fairness so fiercely that when life shows him how cruel and unfair it can be, he shatters. And his shattering is devastating, not just for him but for everyone who placed their hope in him. His transformation is one of the most painful character arcs I've ever seen. To watch someone fall from idealism into vengeance is to witness the corruption of the very thing you wanted to believe in. He becomes proof of the adversary's philosophy, that everyone has a breaking point, that even the purest soul can be twisted by enough pain. I remember feeling almost betrayed, as though I had lost a friend. And yet, isn't that betrayal part of what makes his character unforgettable? He reminds us that goodness is not invincible. It must be protected, nurtured, and sometimes, it is lost. The woman caught between these two men, the vigilante and the attorney, embodies another kind of tragedy. She is torn not only by love but by ideals. Her affection for one is grounded in memory, in who he was before he became a symbol. Her love for the other is rooted in possibility, in the hope of a future where masks and shadows are no longer needed. She doesn't just choose between two men, she chooses between two visions of the world. And what breaks my heart is that her choice is stolen from her before she can fully make it. She becomes, in a sense, the sacrifice upon which the entire story pivots. I sometimes think of her as a modern Antigone, caught between duty and desire, between personal love and public obligation. And like Antigone, her fate reminds us that even in tales of grand heroes and villains, it is often the ordinary human heart that bears the greatest cost. And then, of course, there is the adversary himself, the character who continues to unsettle me no matter how many times I revisit the story. He is not simply a villain. To call him that feels inadequate. He is chaos incarnate, a force of philosophy as much as flesh. He doesn't want money, doesn't crave power in the traditional sense. What he wants is to expose, to pull back the veil of civilization and show us what we are underneath. What terrifies me about him is how close his arguments sometimes come to feeling true. When he speaks of corruption, of hypocrisy, of how quickly people abandon their morals when fear strikes, I find myself unable to dismiss him entirely. He's like that voice inside all of us, the one we usually silence, whispering that maybe all our structures are fragile illusions. It's uncomfortable, isn't it, to realize that part of us nods along? That's the genius of his character. He's not just external chaos, he's the chaos we carry within. And the way he performs this philosophy, through games, through choices designed to strip away pretense, reminds me of the tricksters in myth and folklore. Loki in Norse tales, the fool in Shakespeare, even the devils in medieval morality plays. They never destroy directly. They tempt, they reveal, they unravel. His laughter, his unpredictability, his cruelty, they all mask a deeper purpose, to hold up a mirror and force us to confront the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. Around these central figures orbit others who may seem minor at first glance but who enrich the tapestry immeasurably. The weary police commissioner, for instance. He's not flamboyant, not extraordinary, but his quiet persistence carries the weight of experience. He is the man who knows compromise, who has seen too much to believe in purity yet still fights because giving up would mean surrendering the city entirely. There's something profoundly moving about his resilience. He reminds me of the unsung characters in literature, the Horatios, the Samwise Gamgees, those who stand quietly at the edges yet provide the backbone without which the hero would fall. And then there's the loyal butler, the confidant who watches the vigilante destroy himself piece by piece. His presence is more than just support, it is conscience. He speaks truths the hero doesn't want to hear, truths that sting precisely because they come from love. His wisdom isn't abstract philosophy but lived experience, the kind of knowledge that comes from watching civilizations rise and fall. And yet even he, for all his counsel, carries the pain of powerlessness, because no matter how much he warns, he cannot stop the spiral. I've always admired him for that balance, unwavering loyalty coupled with brutal honesty. It's the kind of friendship we all need, though few of us are fortunate enough to have it. Each of these characters, major or minor, interlocks with the others in a kind of moral symphony. They aren't just individuals, they're ideas in motion. Hope, despair, chaos, order, sacrifice, corruption, all embodied in flesh, clashing against one another in ways that leave scars. That's what makes the story feel so literary, so much more than entertainment. It's a meditation on human nature, told through characters who refuse to be simplified. What stays with me most, though, is the way these arcs converge at the end. The vigilante, bearing the weight of others' sins. The attorney, consumed by his own. The adversary, laughing even in defeat because he knows he has planted seeds of doubt that will never die. The woman, silenced forever, her absence shaping every decision that follows. The commissioner, forced to collude in a lie to preserve hope. Each resolution is not neat, but jagged, unfinished, like wounds that never fully heal. And that feels truer to life than any tidy ending ever could. When I reflect on these characters, I can't help but see pieces of myself in each of them. The vigilante's stubbornness, his refusal to let go of burdens he should never have carried alone. The attorney's belief that justice could be simple, and the devastation that comes when reality proves otherwise. The woman's quiet yearning for a love that might never be reconciled with duty. The adversary's dark whispers that maybe, just maybe, order is an illusion. The commissioner's weary endurance. The butler's bittersweet wisdom. It's almost as if the story isn't asking us to choose who we admire, but to admit that we are all, in some measure, all of them. And maybe that's the real lesson, that chaos and order, hope and despair, sacrifice and corruption, they aren't external forces. They're within us. The characters simply give them shape, so we can watch them clash and, in doing so, recognize the same conflicts inside ourselves. That, I think, is why this story endures. Not because of spectacle, though it has plenty. Not because of clever twists, though those are masterfully done. It endures because its characters are mirrors, reflecting the best and worst of what it means to be human. And once you've looked into those mirrors, you can never quite look away. What has always fascinated me, maybe even as much as the story itself, are the secrets that hide behind the making of it all. You see, when a film takes root in your heart the way this one has in mine, it's natural to wonder about the invisible hands that built it. The scaffolding, the hidden gears, the sleepless nights, and the tiny accidents that ended up shaping moments we now consider legendary. And if I'm being honest, the more I dug into the history of its creation, the more uncanny it felt. Almost as if the universe itself wanted to leave fingerprints on the film. There's something unsettling, in the best way, about how reality bled into fiction during its making. One of the strangest truths is how fiercely the director clung to realism. While other films of its kind often drown themselves in digital spectacle, this one insisted on grounding itself in the physical world. Entire sequences that you'd swear were the product of CGI were, in fact, terrifyingly real. The unforgettable image of a massive truck flipping end over end in the middle of a city street? That wasn't trickery. That was an actual truck, weighing tons, being launched by carefully hidden hydraulics. The sheer audacity of that decision still amazes me. Imagine standing there, part of the crew, watching metal and glass twist in the air like some monstrous toy. It wasn't just about spectacle, it was about truth, about weight, about making us feel the danger in our bones. I remember reading how the director believed that audiences, even if they didn't know exactly why, could always sense when something was real. And maybe that's what unsettles us so deeply when we watch that truck flip. We know, deep down, that it actually happened. It's not pixels. It's gravity and steel and human daring. Then there's the story of the hospital explosion, a moment that has become iconic for reasons that go far beyond the script. It's eerie to think that such an immense sequence almost went terribly wrong. The scene required a real building to collapse in flames, detonated with frightening precision. But here's the thing. During the actual shoot, the explosions misfired. The actor in the nurse's uniform, the one leading the scene, wasn't expecting the delay. So when he paused, fiddled with his props, and looked around as if impatient with the chaos, it wasn't written in the script at all. That little display of frustrated improvisation? That's just him, waiting for the pyrotechnics team to get it right. And when the building finally erupted in its full fury, the fact that he didn't flinch, that he rolled with it as though it were all part of the plan, that was pure instinct. What could have been a disastrous mistake turned into one of the film's most unforgettable moments. Isn't that strange? A glitch in reality birthed a piece of cinematic perfection. I sometimes think about how many of our favorite moments in life happen the same way, not through meticulous planning, but through chaos finding its own rhythm. The stories about the actor who brought the adversary to life still give me chills. He was known for total immersion, for slipping so fully into character that the line between man and mask became dangerously thin. During rehearsals, he encouraged the cast to surprise him, to attack him, to push him physically so that his reactions would be raw. The scene where he claps slowly in the prison cell? Completely unscripted. Just a spontaneous gesture eerie in its stillness, that the crew wisely decided to leave untouched. It's these little moments, unscripted, unexpected, that reveal the depth of his genius. And yet, behind that genius lay a darkness. The stories tell of sleepless nights, of notebooks filled with scribbled philosophies, of a mind working overtime to inhabit chaos. He even locked himself away in a hotel room for weeks, cutting off the world, just to find the voice and the rhythm of the role. I don't think I'll ever shake the image of him pacing alone, jotting down twisted thoughts, building a creature that felt less like acting and more like conjuring. There's something unsettling about it, something that makes me wonder whether he was playing the role, or the role was playing him. The dedication of the rest of the cast was no less intense. The actor playing the vigilante, for instance, endured a suit that weighed so heavily, it restricted his breathing and forced him into a particular posture. That rigid, almost predatory stance we see on screen wasn't just performance, it was necessity. He couldn't move any other way. His voice, too, became a point of obsession, evolving into that now infamous growl. Some mocked it, others admired it, but either way, it became part of the myth. And the fact that he pushed through the discomfort, that he embraced the limitations of the suit to build a presence that was both human and larger than life, speaks to the brutal sacrifices behind every scene. Even the setting, the city itself, carries hidden stories. The choice to film in real urban landscapes rather than sound stages gave the movie its grit, its palpable texture. But it also came with challenges. Imagine trying to orchestrate elaborate car chases and pyrotechnics in the middle of a living, breathing city. Streets had to be shut down. Residents had to be placated. And in the middle of all that chaos, the film crew worked like ghosts, moving silently, leaving behind explosions and overturned cars as though the city itself had become part of the cast. There's a haunting anecdote about one of the stuntmen nearly losing his life during production. In a high-speed chase sequence, a camera operator riding in a specially rigged vehicle was involved in an accident that claimed his life. The tragedy casts a long shadow over the film, a reminder that behind the exhilaration of cinema lies risk, sometimes deadly. It's a sobering truth that art, for all its beauty, often asks for sacrifice. And then there are the little things, the details so small you might miss them, but once you know, you can't unsee them. The adversary's scars, for instance, applied painstakingly every day, sometimes taking hours, yet made deliberately inconsistent. Each appearance is slightly different, as though his own story about how he got them changes not just in words but in flesh. It's a subtle trick, one that reinforces the idea that his past is unknowable, that his very body is unreliable as evidence. Another oddity, the use of IMAX cameras, bulky and temperamental beasts, for sequences that most directors would have captured with ease on smaller rigs. But here, there was a commitment to scale, to immersing the audience so fully that even the width of the frame became part of the storytelling. Those cameras were loud, heavy, and fragile, yet the team pushed them to their limits. There's something strangely poetic about that, using imperfect, cumbersome tools to capture a story about imperfection and burden. I also love the story of how the director kept many of his actors in the dark. He believed that true surprise was invaluable. So he withheld full scripts, gave only fragments of information, and let moments play out with raw spontaneity. That shocked reaction you see on the faces of the hostages, the confusion in the eyes of the henchmen, much of it wasn't performance. It was genuine uncertainty, born of being kept outside the full picture. To me, that mirrors the very philosophy of the adversary himself, forcing people into situations without control, then watching how they react. There's also something deeply unsettling about the coincidences surrounding its release. The real-world tragedy that unfolded at a midnight screening years later cast a long, painful shadow over the film's legacy. Though unrelated to production, it blurred the boundary between fiction and reality in a way that makes revisiting the story feel even more haunting. It's as though the chaos the film conjured on screen leaked into the world around it, leaving scars that no one could have foreseen. Even the musical score carries its own strange history. The composer used razor blades on violin strings to create that unsettling, high-pitched sound associated with the adversary. It's almost grotesque when you think about it. Metal scraping against gut and wood, producing a noise that crawls beneath your skin. That sound isn't just music, it's unease distilled into vibration. And every time it rises in the background, you don't just hear it, you feel it, like a whisper at the base of your skull. And perhaps one of the strangest things of all is how the film has been interpreted. Some see it as a political allegory, others as a psychological study, still others as a commentary on post-9/11 fears. The director himself has remained deliberately vague, refusing to pin it down. And maybe that's the point. By refusing to explain, he left it open, a kind of Rorschach test where we see not just the film, but ourselves. Looking back, I realize how much these behind-the-scenes stories echo the themes of the story itself. Chaos intruding on order. Accidents birthing brilliance. Pain fueling performance. Secrets and lies shaping outcomes. It's almost uncanny, as though the process of making the film became a reflection of its own narrative. And isn't that the strangest fact of all? That a work of art so obsessed with the thin line between order and chaos ended up embodying that very struggle in its creation. Trucks flipping when they shouldn't, buildings exploding late, actors losing themselves in madness, tragedies offset, improvisations becoming legend. It's as though the world conspired to make the film more than fiction. It became, in some ways, a mirror not just of human nature, but of the messy, unpredictable process of creation itself. And that, I think, is why I can't stop talking about it. Not just because of what happens on screen, but because of all the ghosts and accidents and strange truths that lurk just beneath. To know these stories is to see the film differently, to feel its weight more keenly. It becomes not just a story we watch, but a story we inhabit, one stitched together not just by intention, but by all the beautiful, terrifying, unpredictable strangeness of reality. There are moments in cinema that live far beyond their frames. They rise from the screen, crawl under the skin, and settle into the corners of our minds where they refuse to leave. This story is full of those moments, but what makes them unforgettable isn't simply spectacle. It's the way they speak, to philosophy, to psychology, to history, even to us personally, in ways that can't always be neatly explained. One of the earliest events that still lingers with me is that chaotic opening. A bank robbery, but not just any robbery. Right away, it becomes clear this isn't about money, it's about ideology. The meticulous plan, the henchmen turning on each other one by one, the sense of paranoia baked into the structure itself. On first watch, it feels thrilling, almost entertaining, the way the dominoes fall. But sit with it longer, and you realize it's a thesis statement. This isn't crime for gain, it's crime as performance, crime as commentary. By the time the mask is removed, we already know, this is a story that will make order itself tremble. Critically, that opening does more than entertain. It dismantles our assumptions about villains. Gone are the cartoonish criminals who steal to get rich. Here, we are introduced to someone who doesn't even care about wealth. That revelation is unsettling because it removes the comfort of predictability. How do you fight an enemy who wants nothing you can bargain with? There's a certain brilliance in how the story then shifts tone, almost lulling us. We see the promise of a savior in the city's attorney, bright-eyed, golden, untarnished. I remember the first time I watched him step into the light and thought, here is hope. Here is the answer. But critically, that hope is seeded precisely so it can be shattered later. That's the cruel beauty of the narrative. The story doesn't just give us a hero and a villain, it teases us with the idea that someone ordinary, someone without a mask, could succeed where the masked vigilante cannot. And by the time that illusion collapses, the pain cuts deeper than any explosion or death. Another significant event that begs to be studied is the interrogation scene. I've returned to it again and again, almost like one revisits a favorite poem or a troubling passage in a novel. The bare room, the harsh lights, the table between them, it is, in many ways, a stage. And what unfolds is not really a conversation but a duel of philosophies. One side believes in control, in force, in extracting order through sheer will. The other side believes in collapse, in corruption, in proving that everyone can break. Watching them collide is less like watching two men and more like watching two worldviews tear at each other. What elevates that moment into something critical, something literary, is how personal it becomes for us. Haven't we all sat across from someone, maybe not literally but emotionally, who challenged everything we thought we knew? Someone whose words lingered uncomfortably, not because they were right, but because they were close enough to truth to make us uneasy? That's the brilliance of this event. It doesn't just move the story forward, it forces us to question ourselves. And then there is the hospital. I think about it often. The image of a man in a nurse's dress, casually strolling away as destruction blooms behind him, is almost absurd in its dark humor. But beneath the surface, it's a chilling commentary. Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, places of healing, of safety. To reduce one to rubble is not just an act of violence but a symbolic gesture, a declaration that nothing, not even our most sacred institutions, is immune to chaos. Critically, the delayed explosion, that odd hiccup that turned into an improvisational gem, makes the scene even more disturbing. Because isn't that how life often is? Violence doesn't always arrive on cue. Sometimes it stutters, sometimes it misfires, and in that pause lies the most unsettling truth of all, unpredictability. When the building finally gives way, it isn't just concrete and steel that collapse, it's our illusion of security. But perhaps the most haunting event of all is the moral experiment with the two fairies. To this day, I don't think I've ever seen a mainstream film present such a direct test of human nature. It's stripped down, almost theatrical. Two groups, two detonators, one choice. Save yourself by condemning the other, or risk annihilation by doing nothing. It's a modern-day trolley problem, but with flesh and blood at stake. What strikes me most is how the scene manipulates time. Minutes stretch into eternities. Every glance, every hesitation becomes monumental. On one side, convicts, men already condemned by society. On the other, ordinary citizens, families, people who see themselves as innocent. And both boats look at each other with suspicion, with the silent assumption that the other must be weaker, more selfish. That tension, the anticipation of betrayal, is almost unbearable. And yet, in the end, the choice to resist violence, to refuse the adversary's terms, becomes the story's quiet miracle. It's not neat, it's not triumphant in the Hollywood sense, but it's powerful. Because it suggests that while chaos is seductive, while despair is easy, there remains, buried deep in human nature, the capacity for restraint, for compassion. And in a film so heavy with shadows, that sliver of light shines all the brighter. From a critical perspective, the ferry sequence functions as a direct challenge to us, the viewers. We are complicit, sitting there in the dark, wondering what we would do. Would we press the button? Would we stay our hand? The scene refuses to let us remain passive. It turns us into participants, forcing us to confront the adversary's question, are we truly as civilized as we claim? The fall of the district attorney is another event that demands attention. His disfigurement is not just physical, it is moral, spiritual. What devastates me most is how quickly grief turns to vengeance, how easily love lost becomes hatred unleashed. Critics often speak of him as the film's tragic figure, and I think that's true. He is the embodiment of the fragile line between justice and revenge, between hero and villain. Watching him point his gun at innocence, demanding fairness from a world that will never provide it, is almost unbearable. Because in his rage, we recognize something familiar, our own yearning for fairness in a universe that rarely gives it. What elevates his arc is how it forces the vigilante into his darkest sacrifice. The choice to take the blame, to shoulder the sins of another, is not just an act of heroism but an act of profound literary resonance. It echoes Christ figures, tragic heroes, martyrs. To become the villain in the eyes of those you protect is perhaps the ultimate test of conviction. And that closing choice transforms the story from mere action into something mythic, something eternal. And then there is the laughter. Not just once, not just in one scene, but as a recurring sound, manic, uncontrolled, echoing through the story like a refrain. Laughter, in most contexts, is joy. But here it becomes terror. It unsettles because it inverts meaning. It asks us, what does it mean to laugh at suffering, to find delight in collapse? The laughter lingers long after the credits, and in that lingering lies one of the film's most profound achievements. The ability to alter the way we interpret even the simplest human gesture. Thematically, these events weave a tapestry of dualities, order and chaos, justice and vengeance, hope and despair. And critically, what makes them so impactful is that none of these dualities are resolved neatly. They remain in tension, like unresolved chords in music. We leave the theater not with answers but with questions, and that discomfort is precisely the point. Emotionally, the resonance of these events lies in their refusal to flatter us. They do not assure us that good always triumphs or that evil is always punished. Instead, they reflect the ambiguity of our own lives, the messiness of our own choices. We are left haunted, unsettled, but also strangely moved. Because in the end, the story doesn't just show us a battle for a city, it shows us a battle for the soul. And isn't that the battle we're all fighting in one way or another? That, to me, is the genius of its critical power. The events don't just entertain. They interrogate. They provoke. They echo. They become mirrors we can't quite look away from, no matter how much we might want to. It always amazes me when I think about how films come to life, not just as finished products we sit down to watch in the theater, but as living, breathing creations built day by day, frame by frame, with sweat, persistence, and sometimes even a little madness. With this particular film, that sense of awe multiplies tenfold, because the more I've dug into its making, the more I've come to realize that it wasn't just a movie, it was an extraordinary act of collaboration, precision, and vision that required hundreds of people to align behind a single dream. And strangely, that dream had moments that felt almost as chaotic and unpredictable as the story the film itself was telling. When I first started reading about the production, what struck me wasn't the scale, though it was massive, involving entire city blocks, experimental camera rigs, and actors who gave everything of themselves, but the way small details and unlikely choices shaped the outcome. I think that's what makes it fascinating. On one hand, you have the grand vision of a director who insists on grounding even the most extraordinary comic book world in a sense of realism, and on the other hand, you have little human accidents, funny mistakes, and creative sparks that made the film what it is today. One of the earliest things that set the production apart was the decision to use IMAX cameras. At the time, it was groundbreaking. No major feature had used them for narrative scenes because IMAX was typically reserved for documentaries or short specialty films. These cameras were bulky, temperamental, and unbelievably loud, which made recording sound nearly impossible. Yet the director was adamant. He wanted the audience to feel the city in its full scope, to be swallowed up by the immensity of skyscrapers and car chases, and only IMAX could capture that sense of scale. When I first learned that entire sequences, like that jaw-dropping opening heist or the chase with the flipped truck, were shot in this format, it made me appreciate how much faith the filmmakers placed in innovation. Imagine the risk. What if the cameras broke down? What if audiences weren't ready? But risks, as this film constantly teaches us, are where the magic hides. And then there's the crew, who had to adapt quickly to this ambitious vision. I find it almost endearing to imagine them wrestling with cameras the size of refrigerators, trying to mount them on helicopters, cars, even on the ground at impossible angles. They'd often run into the problem of the cameras literally tearing through film stock, snapping it mid-shoot because the reels were so large and moved so violently. Yet the team pressed on, and the result was imagery so crisp, so immersive, that to this day it sets the film apart visually. I remember the first time I saw those IMAX sequences in a theater, and it felt like falling forward into the screen. I didn't realize at the time that this sensation came from a crew willing to sweat through endless technical headaches just so I could have that moment of awe. Behind-the-scenes stories also reveal something I've always admired, the sheer dedication of the cast, particularly one performance that has since become almost mythical. It's easy to mythologize genius after the fact, but what's extraordinary is how much of the character's menace and unpredictability came from improvisation on set. There's this now famous anecdote about a scene in the jail, where the character claps slowly after hearing an announcement. That wasn't scripted. It wasn't even expected. It was simply an actor staying so deep in character that he found truth in the silence. And the crew, sensing something remarkable, let it play out. Every time I revisit that moment, I think of the cameramen, the sound engineers, everyone behind the frame holding their breath, realizing they were capturing lightning in a bottle. Of course, not all improvisations were so eerie. Some were downright practical. There's the unforgettable moment involving a hospital and an explosion, a scene that looks like pure chaos but was in fact meticulously planned. Except for one thing, the detonation didn't go off as scheduled. The actor, instead of breaking character, fiddled with his remote, smacked it against his hand, and played it off with comic frustration, buying just enough time for the delayed charges to finally go off. That's the take we see in the film, and it's far better than any polished version could have been. To me, that's the beauty of filmmaking. Sometimes the most authentic art comes from accidents embraced. Even the grand stunts have their quirks. The flipping of the semi-truck in the middle of downtown still feels like something out of a fever dream. What makes it remarkable is that it wasn't computer-generated, it actually happened. The crew designed a system with a giant piston underneath the truck that would slam into the ground and send the vehicle end over end. Before the stunt, the director insisted on watching it unfold from a safe but close vantage point, almost like a kid watching his toy car flip in the sandbox. The sheer trust in physics and engineering astounds me. There was no backup CGI safety net. Either the truck flipped as planned, or the entire shot would collapse. And it worked. Every time I revisit that moment, I feel the adrenaline not just of the chase itself, but of the people who built, tested, and finally unleashed that beast of a stunt. The production wasn't without its strange challenges either. One recurring theme that makes me chuckle is how the costumes created unexpected obstacles. The new version of the protagonist's suit was designed for mobility, solving the problem of the stiff-necked versions from earlier films. But with greater flexibility came new headaches. The material would overheat under studio lights, leaving the actor drenched and exhausted, or the cowl would pinch in ways that made it difficult to deliver lines naturally. And then there were the practicalities no one likes to talk about, like how difficult it was to use the restroom in full costume, details that sound silly, but are painfully real when you're stuck in 20 pounds of molded armor for 12-hour shooting days. These are the tiny human truths behind the illusion of invincibility we see on screen. The crew also had to deal with curious onlookers during location shoots. Imagine trying to film a tense, dramatic scene while tourists with cell phones gather across the street, snapping photos and yelling comments. Chicago, which doubled as the heart of the fictional city, wasn't just a backdrop, it was a living, breathing organism that refused to stay quiet for the cameras. At one point, curious fans kept shouting the actor's name mid-scene, forcing retakes. Instead of frustration, though, the director found a kind of charm in it. Proof that the world he was creating already felt alive to people even as it was being built. There are also stories of humor and warmth among the cast that make me smile. The actor playing the loyal butler was known for his professionalism, but he was also something of a prankster. During rehearsals, he would sometimes tell absurd stories with a straight face, just to break the tension. One story goes that he deliberately left the set when a particularly chaotic scene was being filmed, because he didn't want the genuine horror on his face ruined by prior exposure. That's dedication, but also a kind of humility that reminds me these are still people, not just icons. And then there are the quiet technical marvels, like the sound design. The villain's theme wasn't traditional music but a single, sustained note, played on a razor-thin string of a violin bow. The composer wanted it to feel like a knife against the ear, something unsettling that would burrow into the subconscious. When I first read about this, I realized how many times I'd felt my stomach tighten during scenes without ever consciously noticing the sound. That's the kind of invisible artistry that often goes unnoticed but shapes our entire emotional response. It's also fascinating how the city itself shaped the production. In one memorable incident, a chase sequence nearly sparked panic because bystanders didn't realize it was part of a film shoot. Imagine walking downtown and suddenly seeing a masked figure on a truck, police cars swerving, and explosions going off. For a moment, reality and fiction blurred. In a way, it seems fitting, given how the story itself plays with chaos spilling into order. But it also shows the logistical nightmare the crew had to manage, coordinating with local authorities, blocking off roads, ensuring safety, and somehow still keeping the illusion alive. The more I think about it, the more I realize that the making of this film mirrors the themes it explores. It's about pushing against boundaries, taking risks, and believing in something that may not make sense until it all comes together. Every behind-the-scenes fact, from the experimental cameras to the improvisations, from the costume headaches to the sound tricks, feels like a piece of the larger puzzle. And much like the film itself, it's the imperfections, the accidents, and the unexpected turns that make the whole story resonate more deeply. What stays with me most are the little human touches. The crew laughing when something went wrong. The actors finding joy in absurd situations, like trying to stay serious while wearing full makeup under glaring lights. The director obsessively checking every frame, yet still leaving space for spontaneity. It all makes me appreciate not just the story I see on screen, but the invisible one. The story of how art gets made by people who dare to believe in it, despite the sweat, the setbacks, and sometimes even the silliness of it all. And maybe that's why I keep revisiting these insights. Because they remind me that movies, no matter how polished, are messy human endeavors underneath. They're full of strange facts, unlikely improvisations, and moments that could have gone terribly wrong but instead went spectacularly right. And perhaps that's what makes this particular film so enduring, not just the tale it tells, but the tale of how it was told, stitched together from fragments of chaos into something that still takes my breath away. There's something haunting about the way a city becomes a character in a story. Not just a backdrop, not just buildings and streets, but a living, breathing presence that shapes the choices of everyone who inhabits it. That's what I felt watching this film, the strange sensation that the streets, the rooftops, the alleys, and the glass towers weren't just places where the action unfolded, but extensions of the story's soul. They mirrored its conflicts, its dualities, and its constant tug-of-war between order and chaos. I think that's why the settings linger in my mind almost as much as the characters themselves. Chicago was the canvas, but it was painted over so thoroughly that it transformed into something mythic, something both familiar and alien. I remember the first wide shots, the tall buildings reaching like silent guardians into the sky, streets stretching endlessly, yet filled with menace, as if danger lurked around every corner. It wasn't the glossy, romanticized version of a metropolis. No neon fantasy, no gothic exaggeration. It was raw, industrial, brutally real. The kind of place you might actually walk through on a gray morning, clutching your jacket tighter against the wind. And that realism made the story bite harder. Every explosion, every chase, every whispered conversation in a dimly lit room carried weight because it felt grounded in the world outside our own doors. But the magic, I think, lies in the contrasts. One moment, we're high above the skyline, the camera gliding like a restless spirit between skyscrapers, giving us that exhilarating sense of power and possibility. The next, we're shoved into narrow alleys where the walls close in, the light barely filters through, and the shadows seem to cling to the characters like hungry creatures. That constant oscillation between vast openness and claustrophobic closeness mirrors the story's tension, the freedom to rise above versus the inevitability of being dragged down into the dirt. Take the bank heist at the beginning. The setting is so ordinary, almost mundane. A regular bank, people going about their day. Yet the way it's framed, the sterile lighting, the symmetrical rows of desks, the hum of fluorescent bulbs overhead, creates an eerie anticipation. The normalcy makes the intrusion of violence feel even more jarring, more disturbing. It's like seeing chaos bleed into the everyday, staining it permanently. I've walked into banks 1,000 times without thinking twice, but that scene changed the way I look at them. Suddenly they seemed fragile, vulnerable to forces far larger than the quiet rhythm of deposits and withdrawals. And then there's the streets at night. There's something about the way they're shot, wet asphalt gleaming under streetlights, traffic signals blinking like nervous heartbeats, that makes the city feel alive in its own right. Every chase, every confrontation against that backdrop takes on a dreamlike quality, as though the city is watching silently, complicit in the madness unfolding within its veins. I always feel a strange chill during those sequences, because the visual texture seems to whisper that the city isn't just a setting, it's a witness. But the settings aren't just external. Interiors play their role with equal force. Think of the cramped interrogation room, bare walls, harsh overhead lighting, no distractions. The emptiness becomes suffocating, a pressure cooker where every movement, every breath is amplified. That stark environment forces us to confront the rawness of the characters, their emotions, their breaking points, without any comforting distractions. It's such a simple choice, and yet it turns the scene into one of the most unforgettable clashes I've ever seen on screen. The room itself becomes a silent accomplice, stripping away the veneer and exposing the ugly truths beneath. Another space that stays with me is the penthouse. Sleek, modern, filled with glass and steel, it embodies wealth and security. But what fascinates me is how easily that illusion shatters when chaos barges in. The very openness of the space, with its floor-to-ceiling windows and elegant minimalism, becomes its weakness. There's no protection, nowhere to hide. It's a reminder that beauty and fragility often go hand in hand, that the higher we build, the easier it becomes for someone to knock it all down. Even the underground settings play their part. Tunnels, parking garages, hidden passageways, they all give off this sense of secrecy and menace. They're places where deals are struck, where violence simmers, where the thin veneer of civility dissolves into primal survival. The dim lighting, the echo of footsteps, the cold concrete walls, they make me feel like I'm peering into the underbelly of the city, the places polite society prefers to forget. And yet, that's where so much of the truth hides. What astonishes me is how the cinematography elevates all of this. It's not just about pointing the camera at a location, it's about bending light, framing, and movement to transform ordinary places into stages of myth and terror. Wide angles capture the scale of the city, making us feel small against its towering presence. Handheld shots throw us into chaos, rattling us with every jolt and movement. And then there are the close-ups, the way the camera lingers on eyes, scars, smirks, forcing us into uncomfortable intimacy with the characters. It's this interplay of distance and closeness that creates the film's rhythm, like breathing in and out, calm and panic, order and disruption. The use of color also fascinates me. There's a muted palette, grays, blues, blacks, that dominates, creating a world that feels drained of warmth, as if hope itself is scarce. But when bursts of color do appear, orange flames licking the night sky, the vivid green of money piled high, the garish face paint of a madman, they shock the senses. They demand attention. They feel like intrusions into a carefully controlled world, ruptures that refuse to be ignored. I've always believed that color in film is like an emotional language, and here it speaks loudly in its restraint. Lighting, too, becomes its own storyteller. Shadows are everywhere, swallowing half of faces, stretching endlessly across walls. It's not just an aesthetic choice. It's a visual metaphor for the blurred lines between good and evil, for the secrets lurking in every corner. There's a particular shot I can't forget. A lone figure standing in partial darkness, the light catching only part of his face, as if the truth itself is split down the middle. That kind of imagery doesn't just look striking, it burns itself into the psyche, reminding us that no one in this story is untouched by shadow. The settings also play tricks with verticality. Rooftops, basements, high-rises, sewers. The film is obsessed with heights and depths. It's as though the city itself is a labyrinth, always pulling characters upward into perilous freedom or downward into suffocating confinement. I've often thought about how this mirrors human psychology, the way we strive for lofty ideals yet constantly get dragged down by darker impulses. Every shot of a character peering over the edge of a building, or plunging into an abyss, feels like a physical manifestation of that internal struggle. One of the most breathtaking sequences for me is the nighttime chase where vehicles roar down empty streets. The cinematography there feels almost symphonic, the rhythm of headlights, the glint of glass, the sudden ruptures of gunfire and explosions. What grips me is the way the city itself seems complicit in the chase, its structures echoing the violence, its silence amplifying the chaos. When I think back on it, it feels less like a car chase and more like a conversation between chaos and control, played out on the streets of a city that can never truly sleep. Even the quieter settings carry weight. A simple kitchen table becomes the stage for confessions and betrayals. A courtroom, with its polished wood and stern faces, transforms into a theater of fragile justice. Each location feels carefully chosen not just for realism, but for symbolic resonance. They're not just places where things happen, they're places that tell us why things happen, places that mirror the themes at the heart of the story. The aerial shots of the city fascinate me most. They have this almost godlike perspective, hovering high above the streets, watching the tiny figures scurry below. And yet, instead of offering clarity, they deepen the sense of unease. From up there, the city looks orderly, symmetrical, controlled. But we know that beneath that surface lies chaos, corruption, and fear. It's a perfect visual metaphor, the illusion of order masking the reality of turmoil. What lingers with me long after is how the settings and visuals create mood. There's a constant tension, a sense that the city itself might crumble at any moment. The cinematography reinforces that unease, sometimes gliding gracefully, other times jolting violently. It's as if the camera itself is caught in the same battle between control and chaos as the characters. That's what makes it unforgettable, not just the story told, but the way the very atmosphere breathes the same anxiety, the same moral ambiguity, the same desperate hope. In the end, the settings aren't just where the story happens. They are the story, in ways subtle and overt. The glass towers reflect ambition and fragility. The alleys whisper of forgotten sins. The bright lights of day fail to banish the shadows that creep in at night. Every location becomes a mirror, showing us not only the characters but ourselves, our fears, our contradictions, our fragile grip on the illusion of order. And that, I think, is the genius of it. A city that should feel familiar instead becomes uncanny, unsettling, yet deeply human. Cinematography that could simply capture action instead captures psychology, morality, and dread. Together, they create not just a setting but an atmosphere that seeps into the bones, reminding us that we're not just watching a film, we're inhabiting a world where light and shadow dance endlessly, and where the stage itself tells as much of the story as the players upon it. There's something magical about peeling back the curtain on a film you already love, as though you're sneaking into a rehearsal space or sitting quietly at the edge of the set while the actors and crew go about their work. The finished movie always feels seamless, almost inevitable, like it could never have turned out any other way. But the truth, the messy, funny, frustrating, deeply human truth, is that it was made moment by moment, decision by decision, often in ways that surprised even the people involved. I've always felt that the behind-the-scenes stories are where the soul of filmmaking really shines. They remind us that cinema isn't built out of perfection, but out of trial, error, collaboration, and the willingness to push through obstacles. And this film, in particular, is rich with those kinds of tales. One of the first things that struck me when I started reading accounts from the set was how grounded everything was. Despite the enormous budget and the star-studded cast, the atmosphere wasn't one of untouchable glamour but of gritty, hard work. Long days, heavy suits, complicated stunts, these were the realities. The director had a reputation for being precise and demanding, yet also strangely quiet, a man who preferred to let the work speak for itself rather than orchestrating big speeches. That style seeped into the atmosphere on set, focused, professional, almost hushed, like everyone knew they were part of something bigger and didn't want to break the spell. Still, there were moments of humor, and those always stand out to me because they feel so wonderfully human. One of my favorite little stories is about how the actor playing the caped hero kept struggling with the new version of the suit. It was an improvement over earlier designs, lighter, more mobile, but it still carried its own set of challenges. Heat was one of them. Imagine standing under intense studio lights, wrapped in layers of molded material, trying to stay serious while sweat pours down your back. Apparently, during one take, he just couldn't take it anymore, ripped off part of the cowl, and made some exaggerated, goofy face that cracked the entire crew up. Those little breaks in tension, those shared laughs, are what kept the atmosphere bearable through the relentless grind of production. Another detail I love is how the actor portraying the main villain interacted with the crew. His performance on screen is legendary, terrifying, unpredictable, deeply unsettling. But off-camera, accounts suggest he was surprisingly gentle, even shy at times. He would skateboard around set during breaks, cigarette in hand, chatting quietly with people. There's something beautifully ironic about that, this towering figure of chaos in the film being almost boyish in real life. Crew members have said that his ability to switch between the role and himself was uncanny. One moment, he was laughing with them, the next he was back in character, voice shifting, body language twisting into something unrecognizable. It must have been surreal to witness that transformation over and over again. Of course, the unpredictability didn't just stay confined to the performances. The production faced real, tangible challenges. Shooting in Chicago meant dealing with a living city that wasn't about to stop breathing just because a film crew had arrived. Streets had to be blocked off, traffic redirected, curious crowds managed. There are stories of people leaning out of office windows to catch a glimpse of the action, or office workers being asked to turn off their lights so nighttime shots wouldn't be ruined. One anecdote tells of a chase sequence where, despite all the planning, bystanders didn't realize it was a movie shoot and panicked at the sight of masked men and swerving vehicles. That's the kind of chaos no storyboard can prepare for. The stunts themselves posed monumental challenges. Take the flipping of the semi-truck. The crew built a massive piston system under the truck, designed to slam into the ground and send the entire vehicle flipping onto its nose. On paper, it worked. In reality, it was terrifying. The stunt driver had to trust that the mechanism would function exactly as planned, that the truck would land in the right way, that everything would hold together. When the moment finally came, the silence before the flip was deafening. And then bang! The truck somersaulted through the air, landing with a crash that shook the street. Applause erupted from the crew, not just because it worked, but because they knew how many things could have gone wrong. That single shot required weeks of planning and a few seconds of sheer courage. Another remarkable behind-the-scenes moment happened during the hospital explosion. The crew had carefully rigged the building with explosives, orchestrating the timing to the millisecond. But technology doesn't always cooperate. When the main character pressed the detonator, nothing happened. For a moment, you can almost imagine the panic on set. Was the shot ruined? Would they have to reset everything? But instead of breaking character, the actor stayed in the moment, fiddling with the detonator, smacking it like a malfunctioning TV remote, while the crew scrambled behind the scenes. And then, at just the right time, the charges went off. The reaction we see on screen, half amused, half annoyed, isn't acting. It's the perfect marriage of accident and professionalism, and it's one of those rare times when a mistake makes the final cut better than the plan ever could have.